Democrats and Republicans calling to protect IVF. Joining us now to break it all down are Martin Luther King Jr. Professor of Law at UC Davis School of Law, Courtney Jocelyn, and Dr. Lauren Wright, political scientist at Princeton University. Ladies, thank you so much for both being here. Courtney, I want to start with you first. Alabama's Attorney General Steve Marshall has said he will not prosecute families using IVF and IVF providers. Yet IVF in the state has essentially come to a halt due to fears of legal backlash. Is the Attorney General sending a message to other prosecutors in the state by saying he will not prosecute?
Great. Well, first, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for engaging with these questions that are so important to so many families in Alabama and around the country. In terms of your question, the AG's statement that he won't prosecute families using IVF or IVF providers is likely not to assuage people's very real concerns on the ground. First, of course, the Attorney General is not bound by his statement. He could change his mind tomorrow and could criminally prosecute IVF users and providers. And more fundamentally, potential criminal liability is only part of the concerns that families and providers in Alabama have today. Prospective parents and providers are also worried about civil liability, which is, of course, what that case was actually about. And again, what the Alabama Supreme Court held in the case is that parties can be liable for punitive damages in civil wrongful death actions for the destruction of embryos, something that is part of standard practice IVF treatment. And indeed, as you suggested, on the ground, what we have seen within a matter of days after the opinion is that at least 3 of the 5 IVF clinics in the state announced a pause in treatment.
And Lauren, I want to get to the political side of this. Republicans have struggled to message on abortion, but have lost on the issue in the past, 2 election cycles. Does this decision present a problem for them going into 2024?
It does. And I think we can see that, as Courtney described, with the on-the-ground reality of the political discussion going back and forth on the Hill and elsewhere this week. Even if former President Trump says he supports IVF, which is actually a boon to Republicans, I don't know how they would get through the next election cycle if the head of the party, in effect, the likely nominee, had something different to say about that. Nikki Haley's position that embryos are babies is much more difficult to defend. But despite that, as long as Democrats, politically wisely probably, continue to bring this up as a campaign issue and make each and every candidate running up and down the ballot on 2024 answer this very relevant question, it is a hurdle, and it will affect every House race and every highly specific district, and especially in those places where the member might not be eventually voting on abortion legislation or about fertility legislation. People still care about these things because it's part of how they decide, especially in a Republican primary, which candidate they choose.
And Courtney, one of the things that Democrats and critics of this decision have been quoting is Alabama's Chief Justice, who was quoted in the decision saying, quote, "Human life cannot be wrongfully destroyed without incurring the wrath of a holy God who views the destruction of his image as an affront to himself," unquote. Does that go against this idea of the separation of church and state that's really so important in this country?
Yeah. And just to do a little bit of stage setting here, right? So by a 7-2 vote, the Alabama Supreme Court held that frozen embryos are children for purposes of the state wrongful death statute. And in the main opinion, Justice Mitchell decided the case on statutory interpretation grounds. But as you indicate in your question, the Chief Justice Parker, wrote a separate concurring opinion. And that concurring opinion offers a religiously grounded rationale for reaching that conclusion. So he writes, for example, that when the voters of Alabama adopted the constitutional sanctity for unborn life provision in 2018, they adopted a theologically based view of the sanctity of life. And as your quote indicated, he uses a lot of religious language in the opinion. He references God more than 40 times, and doing so in a judicial opinion is extremely unusual. By rooting the decision in a theological view, one may argue that it impermissibly violates the First Amendment of the Constitution, which prohibits government establishment of religion.
Right, right. And Lauren, I want to go back to you. Last week, former President Trump said he supports IVF. Does he risk alienating portions of his anti abortion base by saying he supports IVF? And will Republicans down the ballot take a cue from him on his messaging?
I don't think so, because first of all, just to start with the polling, even Republicans, even conservative Republicans, are very mixed on this, and their opinion on abortion doesn't always gel with their opinion on IVF or embryos. And so about half of Republicans, 50%, believe embryos are children and should be treated this way under law. The other half don't. There's a lot of mixed opinion on these things. The other half of it is Trump specific. And I've written a lot about this. I wrote a book about how Trump's celebrity status really helped propel him to a win in 2016. And part of that is because he is simply held to much different standards than traditional politicians are. And so while a traditional politician that's running as a Republican might have to adhere much more closely to the party's religious values, Trump gets to say, I'm a business guy, I'm not a politician, I'm not the same as these other people. And he has extreme ideological flexibility. And so last week when I was talking to Leland Vittert about this on NewsNation, I was saying if anyone could come out in support of IVF as a Republican and not face any consequences whatsoever, it's former President Trump, because the base loves him no matter what he says, and he has much more flexibility on policy than any other Republican candidate I've seen in recent years.
But still, we're seeing Democrats wanting to go on the offense on this. We saw Senator Elizabeth Warren say last week that IVF will be, quote, on the ballot in 2024. Lauren, do you think she's right?
I do. And, again, I think it's smart for Democrats to bring that up. It might fall flat in a setting like a debate stage, which I don't even think we're going to get to see, where Trump just says, well, I said that wasn't true. That's not how I see it. And then Democrats have to do this work of saying, well, think about the Supreme Court, imagine your other legislators, imagine the other impacts. But it is, in effect, harder when the former president, the likely nominee, has staked out a pretty clear stance on this in support of fertility treatments like IVF, despite, what the rest of his record is. And he's, of course, largely responsible for the very conservative Supreme Court that we currently have.
Courtney, finally, do you see this decision ultimately being appealed to federal courts?
No, I don't. I'm not involved. I'm not representing anyone here. I don't know whether there will be an attempt to seek further review in the Supreme Court. But I do think what is clear is that this decision, whether or not it is appealed, will have ripple effects not only within the state of Alabama, but beyond its borders. Within the state, there are issues that are not yet resolved, whether, for example, there could be criminal liability for the destruction of embryos. Beyond the borders of the state, while this decision is not directly binding on the courts of any other state because it's a decision of a state Supreme Court interpreting a state statute, I think what we are going to see is that this decision will serve as an invitation, really, to courts in other states to follow in this court's footsteps and to embrace the notion of fetal personhood. And I think it certainly puts wind in the sails of those who have been making this argument for many years. There are some states where I think the groundwork really has been laid, states that have statutes that are similar to the constitutional provision in Alabama. Many other states are considering fetal personhood provisions. And if this argument is more broadly embraced, I think what we will see is that other Supreme Court decisions, including the decision in Griswold protecting access to and the right to use contraception, will be placed at risk. So again, I think what the thing that we can safely say is that this is not the end, it is the beginning, and we will see this argument being made and likely being embraced in more courts around the country.
Certainly the beginning to a big legal and political fight. Lauren Wright and Courtney Jocelyn, thank you so much for joining me here today.
Thanks for having me.